Chess greetings and welcome to Chess Collab. Alfred is my name. Today, we are going to focus on castling as a special move. Right, in short, castling belongs to the king. That's what you have to know. I'm going to emphasize as we progress. Right, as you can see, we've got a white king and one black king on the chessboard. So I'm going to explain based on the scenario on the chessboard. It involves both the king and one rook. So in other words, your king is, in other words, you have to do this. Well, but it all depends on the position on the chessboard. Your king has never moved. In other words, if you haven't moved your king, that's only when you are able to do this special move. This special move also includes the rook. A rook which has never moved. So in other words, since we've got two rooks, castling can occur on both sides. But you have to choose one side. So in other words, I can say we've got two options. I mean, as far as castling is concerned. And in between the king and the rook, that is in between here, no pieces should be present there. In other words, the pieces which might have been there would have moved already. Right. So this is just for the sake of demonstration. Right. Right. In other words, there, the knight is already moved. So it's no longer there. Where there are those blue dots, they are open squares. That's only when castling can occur. Right. On the white side, where I am placing the dots. There we go. And as you can see, this side on the white side here, which is the opposite there, so opposite the side of the for black, it have got three dots. And this side for black, there were two dots. We're going to talk about this as we progress. And also, you are able to castle when you are not in check at that moment, at that particular time. Two options, as I've already indicated. Let's dive onto the first option. The first option is the one which you're going just to focus on at the moment. When you castle, you move your king 2 squares towards the rook. So in other words, if it's here, moves 1, 2, then you place your rook here, then you bring over the rook. In other words, follow that arrow which I've just inserted. In the same move, transfer your rook over the top to the next square. In other words, you just bring over the rook and you just place it on the other side. But please remember, touch the king first. It's a rule in chess. Remember, castling belongs to the king. It's the only time in chess where two pieces can move. And it is described as one move. Single turn, in other words. Each player can do once in a game. As I've already indicated, it's optional. Castling, why castling? Castling is done to bring the rook to a safer position. In other words, as you can see here, it will be behind these pawns. Start with the king all the time, as I've indicated. Castling belongs to the king. That's what you have to know. Right, let's move on. Position after castling. Remember, I've told you in this case. So you're going to see where the new position, where will be the pieces. That is the king and the rook. Right, they've already swapped. There comes the king. The king is now on g8. There comes the rook. The rook is now on f8. This is what you call kingside castling, because the side which you've castled, the king was here, where I am pointing using my laser here. Right. So if it will be on this other side, that will be a queenside castling. We're going to dive as we progress. And remember, castling is done to bring the king to safety. I've already indicated you start with the king. You hold the king. If you've forgotten this, please hold the king and the rook at the same time. In this case, the first option which you have done is what we call short castling. Let's have a look at the second option. Remember, 2 squares towards the rook. That's what we are going to do. And we are going to perform it for white in this case. Right, there we go. As you can see. And remember, it's regarded as one move. You just bring over the rook. And this is what we call the long castling. Start with the king all the time. Right, let's see. Option 2, position after castling. Remember, always this side. Right, there we go. So in other words, the king will be there on C1. Then the rook will come over on the other side, just next to the king. That's where you place your rook. And then your rook will be on D1. Right, and this is what we call long castling. In other words, also regarded as the queen side castling. Why do we regard it as a long castling? You're going to see we have got 3 squares in between before castling occurred. Let's have a different scenario, more on castling. Remember, you cannot castle if your king would end up in check. What do I mean? For example, as you can see here, in this case, well, this is just passing through check because remember, it moves 2 steps. So this rule cannot castle if your king would end up in check. For example, if we had a rook in between here, a rook or a queen here, that means it was going to realize itself landing in check. So in other words, let's say we've got a queen on G7. Then once it's here, after castling, that means the king will be under check and it's not allowed. So you cannot castle. Once you realize that, right. In this case, to castle, you're not allowed. Why? Simply because the king will pass through check, going to its destination, which is on G1. So you cannot castle there. Right. In this case, white cannot castle because it would put his king in check from the black bishop. You cannot castle if the square your king crosses is attacked by an enemy piece, as I've already indicated there. Right. We bring in the rook. Right. For black, this side now. The rook is targeting that square. So that means if you intend to castle, you're endangering the king. It will be passing through check. Black cannot castle because his king will cross over the D8 square, which is attacked by the rook on D1. So I've already indicated. So castling is a little bit tricky, but you should be fine as long as you remember the rules associated with castling. It's a one move and it's quite great indeed. Remember to subscribe and share so that next time when I upload, you should be able to see the new lesson. And also, please attempt the quiz, which is self-marked, to test your progress. It's quite interesting indeed. Thank you very much for joining.